this is working. Warm welcome from my side. Last guests are coming. Thank you very much for joining and packing this cinema with people. It's really, really good to see you all here. And it's nice, by the way, to be in the Hall 3 again for me the first time this year. So it's a good cinema. A warm welcome to the next session. It's called The Survival Guide to Digital Workflows. We're doing it together with some fantastic partners. I want to mention them because we are really good at partners in many, many things. It's Canon and it's Tectum, it's our film and equipment rental, and of course the DFFB, the film school, and the ones of you who are attending also the camera studio will get to know the DFFB better. But this morning it's a survival guide. It's going to be an adventure, but you have really good guides with you, these two gentlemen here, and I would love to introduce you to them briefly before I leave the floor up to them. It's Stefan Ciupek. He's a cinematographer and colorist, and he's one of the early adopters in terms of digital production, and he worked on several films. I think Russian Ark is one that should be mentioned, SLUMDOG Millionaire, Antichrist, and last and recently you worked mainly as a cinematographer. So I think it's also good in terms of what we will discuss here, being the role between in between digital pre-production, production, and being a cinematographer, and what does this mean nowadays. Next to him, it's Dirk Meier. He's a German colorist, and I hope you checked out his IMDb. Because it's a long list of films that he worked for. I want to mention just once again some of them. It's Antichrist or Hannah Arendt, and one that I would love to mention here especially is A Pigeon Sat on a Bench Reflecting on Existence, so the Roy Andersson film that we've just recently seen in the cinema, and I hope you checked it out already, so because it's a wonderful film also in terms of the color management and the coloring. So I leave them up to you. There's one thing, this is a special session, and the material that is going to be shown here is brand new. And so that's the specialty of this survival guide. So everything, please, should be kept here in the room. So don't do any, although you're a cinematographer probably, don't use cameras. Don't do it. So we just keep it here in the room. And then I'm sure it's going to be fine. So, thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for coming and enjoy.
Thank you. A very warm welcome from us as well. We have been doing a similar lecture before. We will refer to this a little bit during the session. But I thought I would want to start actually with a question for you. We're talking about survival guide and digital workflows, and we've been doing this for years, and everything's digital now, and cinema and cameras and everything. So we seem to be overwhelmed by all this technical stuff. And I wondered if you have to pick one of these pieces, these technical devices, what would you say is actually the most important one, the one that you can't do without it? When you think about it, I mean, talking about technical devices you need for filmmaking, what would it be? Stefan, you as a...
Maybe camera, I think.
You're a cinematographer, so that's quite close, yeah. But have you seen Wall-E, for instance? I don't think they did use so many real physical cameras on that, so. And they succeeded in doing a great, fantastic, very successful movie. So anything else you would think? Well, maybe the coffee machine and the production managing office. Maybe the typewriter for writing the script. Well, you can do films, or films have been done before we had digital cameras, before we had, or even without using cameras and just scratching something on some celluloid, all these things have been done. But I believe there's one piece that you can't leave out. Without that, we wouldn't have cinema or storytelling with motion pictures. And that's the projector or display. If you want someone to see what you've been doing, the films that you've been doing, then you need something to show it. Let's call it a display. It doesn't matter if it's that size or maybe a bit smaller, maybe TV screen, maybe tablets today. That's what I thought would be interesting to mention. And what do all of these devices need to work? Yeah. There is light, even without power. Candles still work. You know, maybe there have been some projectors even using non-electric power. But light is the one thing that we really need to tell stories in cinema. Without it, there wouldn't be the images that we can capture. So that's one aspect, of course, we want to talk about. Me as a colorist, I also need to be aware of all the different ways and the different interpretations of light or colors, and there are many words for that. How would you call this, for instance? What kind of color? White? Yeah, I think so. Would you agree, Stefan?
Yeah, I think it looks like white.
That looks pretty white, yeah, I agree. But then, what is this? Super white. There's not a trick if you look at it. I don't make it darker, it's just as it is. But before you said it would be white, and kind of white viewers usually think that's the brightest thing that we have. And then suddenly something comes up and that's actually brighter than that. So now the previous one is maybe more grayish than this one. And that's then ultra bright white. How does this work? Why does it work? Contrast? Yeah. What? Yeah. You adapt your eye. And that's a fantastic thing. That's also a problem a lot of times, especially when you're sitting in a grading suite, that we all adapt. Our vision works really very, very relative only, and we need a reference. And that's one fantastic thing about cinema. To go back to this, you don't have any other reference than what is on screen. In television viewing at home, that's a little different. You have background light and so on, and then there's something you can compare it to. But our vision needs this as a reference. So if I show you this, then this becomes the brightest part of it, and then everything else relates to it. Okay, but it's not going to get brighter than this. But do you really think this is white? Maybe the other one is the right white? Or that one? I don't know. Which one would you pick?
The middle?
The middle one? Okay. Which one do you think is the correct white? Technically correct white? Shall you vote? Who's for here, the right one? Okay, maybe quarter. The middle one? Another quarter. This one? Left one? None, okay. And then there are a lot of people who don't want to make a choice. Well, how does it work? Who defines what is the correct white? You have to have a reference again. It's something that is able to measure how it behaves, how it relates to the reference. And if you would ask me, I have to say, actually, I can't tell you. The thing is, I know what I created on my laptop for the presentation, and I can tell you that the middle one is the one that technically is like neutral, like red, green, and blue are the same. It's kind of color neutral. That should be white. But now coming back to the projector or the display, this really defines if it's really the correct white. You have to have a way of measuring it to the reference. You have to take and measure this output from the projector and then see, is this really the correct white? Technically speaking, in the video world, this would be D65 white point, something around 6,500 Kelvin and so on. And without doing that, even I can't really tell you, because I'm as relative in my vision as you. I adapt to the things. So maybe this is the correct signal that I put out, but to make sure that it looks correct, you have to talk about the display. Just for you as filmmakers, to make you aware about this fact a little bit, I like this presentation or this start, which I have to say, the original idea with the different rings I took from Charles Poynton, a great guy in doing lectures, and he was one defining the HD standards and so on. Who of you ever calibrated your laptop screen? Hands up. Really? I mean, that's much more than I expected. Very well to you. That's great to know, because a lot of times asking students, there's like no one, and more people start to watch films and talk about their references when they talk about the script, talk about visual ideas, just watching them on their laptops. And it's not so difficult anymore, and I just can encourage you, because of what you've seen now, maybe to actually think about spending a bit of time in checking and calibrating your screens that you use. But so far, for a little introduction, sorry. We are here to talk about something else as well, which all relates to this. But we will have some examples of Stefan's latest movie that he shot as a DOP together with Felix Kramer, who's also here in the audience, which is an interesting concept as well, that I'm curious to learn about, how it worked. And then, since we are here actually the third time, we also thought maybe we work in episodes, and we want to give you a little recap of what happened in the last episode, which was a very interesting and funny session as well, about 127 hours. And since there are maybe some similarities or so, we wanted to give you a quick start into that and show you the trailer of 127 hours and then start about it. Okay? This is actually, the last session was recorded as well, so we just rolled back to what has been done in the last episode of our presentation, and then just go right into I think I lost even more hair since.
Hours I've worked on as a digital camera supervisor and also a second unit additional cinematographer, and it was a very interesting experience. Here's a trailer. Are you ready?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I'll talk a bit more about it after you've seen the trailer, so we know what it's about.
Okay, then lights down, please.
Good morning, everyone. It is 7 o'clock here in Canyonland, USA.
Hey, Aaron, Mom still has not heard from you. Will you just call her, please? I'll talk to you soon.
And this morning, on the boulder, we have a very special guest, Aaron Ralston!
Oh gosh, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you. Thank you. Hey, the last, I'm a guy. What do you say? See, I'm something of a big heart hero.
All you have to remember is that everything will be okay.
You didn't tell anyone where you were going.
So, you worked as a digital camera supervisor on that, and also did some additional photography for that.
Yeah, one of the very special aspects of that film is that there were two cinematographers involved. As there's only one character caught in the canyon, Danny Boyle had the idea to get two different visual signatures for the film. So he's taken two separate cinematographers and also made them work separately in terms of creating maybe two visual languages for the film. That was an interesting concept for the project. A very challenging part of it was, as you can see here, that we've been shooting a big part of the film on real location, and that was quite a challenge in terms of the technical. The whole work set up there in the wilderness was quite difficult to achieve. Even the studio stuff was difficult to work within because Danny Boyle insisted on having the set being built in the real scale of the canyon, so there was no removable walls. The idea was to have everything as tight as it was on real location, so for cinematographer, no real advantage to move kind of freely within there. As this was kind of, this project was shot on a variety of formats. We used the SLUMDOG camera, which is the same camera we've been using on SLUMDOG Millionaire. The idea again, having a small, portable, very compact camera to use on the project. And a further development from the film. Some stuff was shot on 35mm. We also used DSLR cameras for time-lapse sequences, some of which I've been shooting. Here you can actually see a nice comparison why we've used that small camera, because for some of the stuff there you see a rigging of a 35mm camera in vertical. How difficult the setup was to get this camera rigged into a canyon actually, compared to using a small camera over there.
Mm-hmm. So I remember that we were actually still grading the film when you started emailing with the production company about getting on board, because it was shot in the USA. It wasn't that easy because of union and immigration stuff and so on. So you came like 1 week, a week late into the shooting on board, but you did have quite a good theoretical prep with them. But how was it when you...
Yeah, since I didn't know whether I was able to actually to get my visa, to get to America to work on the film, I started to prepare the film as if I would doing that. So basically 6 weeks in advance I started preparing, talking to all the people involved, and there was also a DIT from America who was kind of supposed to kind of take over in case I don't get a visa. And I found this, I mean, I treated it as if I would kind of prepare a project and would know for 100% sure that I'll be working on it. So I spoke to the post-production supervisor, a lot to Anthony, Mental, the DP, discussing like the requirements for the shoot and find the perfect custom-built camera setup for the film.
So then you arrived on set, and how was it?
Well,
Was it that bad?
I think even worse, maybe. It was a nightmare, it was shocking. I arrived on set, I never saw a director so unhappy, and the whole like set it seemed all a bit chaotic in terms of, you know, that I felt like there was a lot of insecurity going on, and as I found out, within that 1 week of shooting, they've lost 1 day's material of one of the cameras, which was supposed to be backed up. Then I kind of checked up on things, and I saw a lot of chaos with the media, which was recorded. So basically the hard drives from the cameras were lying around unlabeled on desks. And basically the complete opposite of what I expected it to be, especially after preparing and sending out a lot of mails, workflow mails, telling people how to do things. So a lot of insecurity, as if this was a huge student film actually. Unbelievable, to be honest.
Yeah, and this is the third part from 3 years ago when we talked about this point. But and it's a quite interesting story how you succeeded in making the director happy again and eventually allowing that the film looks like it is. But we're here to discuss your new film and not talk about this. So how the interesting question for me now is, with all this experience from many other productions as well, now being a cinematographer yourself, how do you approach other projects now making sure that these kind of pitfalls and disasters will not happen. That's what we want to discuss. So let's get back to this film. And tell us a bit about maybe the film in general.
So The Dark Side of the Moon is based on a novel by a Swiss writer, Martin Suter. It's a best-selling novel. And we shot it mostly on location in Luxembourg and Cologne area. And it basically tells the story of a very successful lawyer who, after having taken a psychedelic mushroom trip, finds out about the dark side inside himself. But I'll let the trailer speak a bit more about this. Just for information, what we show right now is not a kind of trailer for the audience. It's a kind of promotional trailer to be used for kind of, showing a bit more of the film. So it's not kind of covering up the whole story of it. It's not meant for the purpose, but it's the first, actually this trailer has been just made last week. It has been screened nowhere before. So you're the first one to see it, so I'm excited to hear what you think.
And the not recording would also include the talents recording. Can we dim the lights, please?
Before I'm starting to talk about the project, I'd like to ask you a question. What do you think was the film shot on? Any ideas? Just a guess. Hmm?
We can probably do a vote again. Who's for Alexa? Okay. What other cameras would you? Canon. Who's for Canon? Less? Red?
Who's for red? Okay. Film?
Yeah, one.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
We're gonna get to that a little later. There's an interesting similarity between this project and 100,000 Hours. That's why I also think it's nice to combine, having started the session with the project. Even on this one, there have been two cinematographers involved, as we already told you. It was Felix and me. Felix was attached to the project already much longer time than me, and he's good friends with the director. And at some point, our common camera assistant got us to talk, and that's how we met. And Felix, I'm still very grateful and happy that he took me on board for the film, because of he expected the scheduling for the project to be difficult. Funding wasn't clear. There was very little time for preparation. So he thought it would be a great opportunity to try work together with somebody and have two cinematographers on set, but basically on the same eye height. And I was a bit worried about this because I've seen the setup on 107 Hours, and there was a lot about egos. We had like 2 DPs and a director and 3 egos involved, and I just felt like it might be difficult. So one of the first rules we've set up for this is no ego, and that actually helped us a lot, because in the end there's only one vision, the film, and if everybody understands that, then you can work together on it. And I already in the first and second meeting with Felix and Stefan Ciupek, the director, noticed that this is an open, creative room where we all share ideas, and everybody is allowed to say anything. And actually, even though I met 2 of them for the first time, it just felt like having been part of a team for a long time. So that was an amazing experience, and it actually really succeeded. We always were on the same page. We never kind of thought, we always discussed things out before we started working, shoot before appearing on set, and then we kind of worked together in one vision, supporting each other on set. So it was very interesting also the way we shared operating. Like basically, we never decided the day before. We basically on the shooting they decided, okay, now I'll operate for half a day and Felix will be with the light as a DP, and then we swapped around and we always shared all ideas, and it was an amazing experience. Very interesting way to work.
I know other crew members, so I know that he's not just talking the PR thing right now. I know but maybe before we go on talking about the film, I'm not 100% sure is everyone aware of the storyline, or do you want to sum this up again, just to give us a background about the film, like the tagline thing?
Yeah, I think I did that already before the film started, so actually I wouldn't tell more than this.
Okay.
If you're interested in it, there is a novel by Martin Suter which you can have a look at.
Another little common thing I notice is that in both films actually a knife has a particular role. But so, since we will talk about the whole workflow, which today becomes a very digital workflow when you talk about the gear and the devices and the certain processing steps, we still have to start up front. So you got the script, and how then do you proceed? How is your approach as a DP in this project, but also in other projects? What do you do?
Yeah, I usually spend quite some time with the script and the story. I try to not enter the visual stage of a project before I really feel like the script has been developed to a point where, you know, it really can move on. So actually the first couple of meetings for me were a lot discussing in the creative room, also with Felix. We had lots of discussions ourselves to kind of team up, and it was interesting to see that there were some synergies between us in terms of we had similar things to the script and the story, and it was very interesting for me then as well to go back to the novel and reread the novel, because a script of a film is always a condensation of a novel. You take 400 pages of a novel into a 100-page script, something has to go out. So I would like to see as a cinematographer the bigger picture, see where does the whole thing come from. And there we also had a lot of interesting discussions why certain scenes have been taken out of the story, out of the script, why certain scenes, Felix and I fought for bringing in back some scenes and making some adjustments, so we stay more true to the novel at some points. It was a very interesting and energizing process, and basically that came first before we started talking about technical and aesthetical decisions, which I find is very important.
Mm-hmm.
It's my part as cinematographer, because we are very close to the director, so we are the ones who can really support the story.
Mm-hmm.
In that sense.
But then from that on, you, of course, as a cinematographer, you have to come up with a visual concept at some point.
Yeah.
And then translate this later into something that allows you to decide, okay, I'm going to use this particular tool.
Yeah, so we spent a lot of time looking at different films which inspired us, discussing the different references. It's always good to have a starting point. And we had a very strong visual concept and idea in the beginning, but as you go on set and start shooting, things change. That's the second step, where you then kind of take a step back and actually let your intuition play into it. So it doesn't get this dogmatic thing in a way. That's the kind of basic idea. So I would say that the shooting concept, which we kind of came up with and which we thought about, obviously we have these different worlds. We have nature and the forest, which is an important part in the film, where the main character is kind of retreating into and looking for some answers in his life. We have, as an opposing very strong part, the cold surrounding of a city, financial district, this whole lawyer's world. And we have the psychedelic mushroom sequences and the whole psychedelic part of it, the psychological part. So we had to kind of deal with 3-4 different worlds and defining them more in the process of working on the film. So some thoughts we had early on, okay, that the nature would have to be shown in as rich detail as possible, and we wanted to use wide immersive shots to kind of show it and portray it. So that had some, so that there we kind of came up with, after discussing all possible formats, that the film should have been shot in scope, and as an opposing part in the city and the city and the lawyer's world should be a bit more kept in cold grays, graphic, longer lens shots. And again, in nature, we wanted to be closer to the actors with some wider lenses, so you kind of see the nature more and also support the transformation of the character, which is an important part of the story, between those worlds.
And you mentioned also the situation in forest where you probably cannot can be light and so on. So
yeah, we early on knew that we're going to shoot in winter time in Luxembourg, which gives us 7.5 hours of daylight minus lunch break, makes pretty short shooting days in rough terrain. And so there we kind of early on thought it's going to be kind of documentary approach in terms of our gear in a lot of situations that we can't light daylight scenes in the forest. So we knew that we would have to work with some minimalistic gear there and just let nature play.
In terms of the color palette, you probably also had some ideas up front.
Yeah, because I mean the forest and nature and all the reference films we shot, we knew it's going to be lots of green, so we discussed kind of the green tones we want to show, and because it's going to go into autumn, so we thought about greens and brown, warm colors, but always wanted to have some color contrast into it, so like thinking about some cold complementary color to that setup. And like in the city areas, like in the law firm, we thought about keeping like cool gray tones and but again having always like complementary colors, so mixing it with tungsten light or kind of basically going away from the standard of just kind of contrasty monochromatic blue pictures. And yeah.
So this is already kind of the conclusion from taking of visual ideas, just from reading script and so on and discussions, into something that is more like a shooting concept where you define, okay, we're gonna have to deal with these situations, you're not gonna be able to build everything and so on, you have to have these locations, and then you come up with this list of things that you're looking for, that you want to achieve. And then a next step is that you have to translate it in real technical terms. What does it mean when I'm asking you, okay, so how did you come to the decision to shoot with X camera?
Yeah, so there's always, for me, this transformation step. First the story, then having the visual idea for it, and then coming up with a camera, as opposed to what happens these days very often, that you get hired and it's said, okay, we're going to shoot this on Alexa, or we're going to shoot this on Red, or we're going to shoot this on this camera because we got a great deal with a rental house. And I always try to reverse that step, because in old film days, it was my decision to choose a film stock to shoot the film and not get this. I mean, right now everybody has an opinion about this. Very often I get asked by actors on set, so, oh, why do we do this camera? Oh, what camera are we shooting this on? So it's an interesting change with technology. Everybody has an opinion about. And I always kind of try to wave the flag that this is my department and I can explain you why I think about it, but let me do my job.
Yeah, you know, as colorists can tell that from experience, that people in the grading suite talking about the next project or whatever, or even just asking the DPs why they chose a particular camera, that I feel sometimes it's not really that kind of approach where you talk about and think about first what is the concept was and what tool would help me most or deliver the best for this thing.
Yeah. Well, an important thing in deciding all of this was breaking the digital colors, breaking the digital look. That's like, one thing was clear to me, that it's hard to describe it. You can say, oh, I want to have a more filmic look, which is kind of, everybody says that these days. What is a filmic look? How do you define that? But at least I know exactly what I don't want and where I don't want to go. I don't want to put it in words because it would be too simplistic to put it there. It's more like an intuition and an experience, and also like me being a colorist for 10 years, I have a certain idea about it. And any description would be too simplistic, because it's not possible to put it just in technical terms to describe this.
Yeah, I totally agree to that. I can't hear the term filmic or organic anymore. And a more technical, more neutral term would be the colorimetry. So the way that a camera captures the colors and how it processes the colors. So of course you have a great interest in a tool that does it on a good level.
That was the main starting aspect, also in discussion with Felix and Stefan and me, that we need to find a camera that is able to capture a big color space and it has a colorimetry that kind of feels like right for the project. And very important second aspect, sorry, now I'm back. Okay, sorry. An aspect obviously is resolution. because we spoke about the realism and also the texture of the forest, I knew I want to have the maximum resolution there to kind of be able to show all those textures in the forest. High latitude and sensitivity are very important as well, because, as I said, in the forest we are forced to shoot pretty much available light with some, adjustments as you always do. So basically we had
latitude again is what?
It's a contrast range the camera is able to capture, basically between black and white, before the camera is clipping. A lot of cameras in past had the problem that they clip very quickly in the highlights and the whites, and so this was an important parameter for us to find the right camera. So we kind of have the freedom in grading later to shape the images of the forest, which we couldn't do with lighting on set, basically. And sensitivity, obviously, was very important as well, because we had short days. We would start in the middle of the night, not in the middle of the night, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, no, sorry. We would start at darkness in the forest, set up the camera, wait for the light to come up to be bright enough for us to shoot. And then we would shoot up until, dawn, and up until, the light would disappear. So basically, to extend that phase, we needed a camera with a high sensitivity.
You decided to shoot scope?
Yeah, it was part of a visual concept. We discussed different formats. Again, it's an open room. Start thinking about 4x3. I mean, Ida was shot in that format. Is it a shooting format for us or not? So for us, we just felt, after having cropped and worked on some still pictures for the aspect, we just felt like that scope is the right format for the film and the genre as well. Yeah, and since, especially for the parts in the city as well, I just felt like there should be no distortions from the lens or no vignetting, so that's also an important aspect if we talk about the idea of maybe shooting CinemaScope with anamorphic lenses. I wanted this kind of crisp, clean image from a lens perspective side for this film. I didn't want to have too strong kind of optical vignetting and diffusion effects.
And at the same time, you needed a variety of different focal lengths, of course, and that also can be limited with certain brands, or especially with anamorphic lenses. Yeah,
that's true. I mean, especially in the forest, we felt like wanting to be able to exactly define the lens we're going to shoot the shot within. Now, the wide range of most prime lenses is like 18, 25, 35. So they are stuck with 3 lenses, and you might want to have exactly a shot in between. And that we really wanted to have the freedom there to have a big variety of prime lenses in that particularly a very important range for us. Because on the long end, it doesn't really matter that much how many gradations of lenses you have, but it just felt so important for us to have a big variety of wide lenses.
So when we prepared this, we thought, I thought, well, this kind of decision process to come out with the name for a camera and for lenses and for other technical gear that you need to shoot it, this is very difficult to picture, because it depends on the experience from both of you, from what you used in the past, and you have so many kind of technical specifications already in your mind that it's kind of, we would need a 3-dimensional space, naming things and be able to show you how it works, how this decision process works, and how the dependencies from maybe deciding you want to shoot a scope to other aspects is. And unfortunately, we had to give in showing you a interactive, 3-dimensional kind of cloud thing that we would love to move around and show this. PowerPoint doesn't have this tool, so the simplest thing we could do was just collect these technical aspects, these parameters, basically in a little table, and to demonstrate a little bit how this would work, I brought my little graphics panel. Choose this.
So we can pick any parameter and then see how it kind of affects the rest of the deciding matrix. And it's a very complex process, which like 80% of this already happens in like my head as an experienced digital cinematographer. But to kind of show you like basically show you how the deciding process should be and make it a bit more simple. We try to show it to you. So if you take the parameter resolution, where I said I want to have a high resolution for shooting the film. Now there are two possible options to do it. One is take a camera with a high sensor resolution. And the other one is increase the resolution as was done on film by using anamorphic lenses, which kind of are able to give you, for CinemaScope, a high resolution image pressed into kind of compressed visually into the 4:3 sensor. So there already are two options at the go.
And then what happens in your mind is like, okay, anamorphic lenses limits, of course, the choice of lenses, that like the brands that you have available, and then that also means, well, it will in that case it would reduce the amount of available focal lengths because they're just not available in very, very wide range, for instance.
And they would affect the sensitivity indirectly because those anamorphic lenses have they're not as light sensitive as other prime lenses. So basically you would have, you know, one important aspect for our film was, as I said, sensitivity. So you don't want to limit yourself by the lenses to be able to like only have 30% of light sensitivity compared to a prime lens.
And yeah, basically this is also the question about aspect ratio. When you would have decided to shoot flat, then you wouldn't even thought about anamorphic lenses, giving you other choices of lenses and a wider variety of focal length and so on. But I would say also later than for post-production, but also for what happens on set, if you want to have really high resolution, usually that means you are capturing more pixels, or in most cameras today, photo sites, because it's not a full pixel. So resolution, of course, has also an impact on the data rate that you kind of capture in camera. So you need maybe media in the camera that is bigger or that is faster. That might be, that of course means that you have to store more information. You also have to copy it on set and so on. And of course, everything always has a kind of impact on cost. And that is true for all these kinds of aspects. If you, did you shoot many slow motion on the film?
Quite a few slow motion shots, yeah.
So we talk about frame rates. And various cameras are able of shooting at different frame rates. Some of them achieve that by actually reducing the resolution. So at the same, some of them not, but that of course then means that you create a higher data rate again, because you capture more frames per second. That of course increases the storage again.
And you have to think about your focal length again, because you know, the sensor is cropped, so all of a sudden your wide lens will become a longer telephoto lens on some of the cameras.
On some of the cameras, exactly. So all these things happen if you think, well, I'm going to choose this camera, but then when we want to shoot this frame rate, when we shoot that and so on, all these different aspects are in dependence of each other. And we could go on for a while and talk about each of these things. It's, then this would look like something like this maybe, and here, and talk about colorimetry, later so this. And latitude and sensitivity, of course, are interesting for post-production of the effect colorimetry, and so on and so on.
So having a producer or director saying like, I want to shoot my film on this and this particular camera, before thinking about all these things, is a difficult thing. There's always the right camera for your project.
Because if we then, I mean, that's what you do in your mind. But then you also have to, you can't build your own camera for each purpose. I mean, for SLUMDOG Millionaire, you kind of did. You probably had something like this matrix before, and then said, okay, we have to pick that up. But on most projects today, of course, you have a certain variety of choice of cameras, brands that would be possible to use. And what are these ones today, basically?
It was the Arri Alexa.
I mean, you basically included those in what you guessed how it was shot.
Yeah. Then there's the Red Epic MX and the Red Epic Dragon, which was like two generations of a similar camera. We also thought about the Sony f55 camera, and well, there's a Canon C500 as well, and many other cameras, but these were the ones like at first thought we kind of took a look at, or kind of, you know, thought through in our mind. And all cameras have a similarity of sharing a roughly Super 535 sensor. Roughly, I mean, because there is some difference, which is also important for you to keep an eye on, because not all lenses will look the same on these cameras. So there's a difference there, and they're all PL mount and CMOS. They have a CMOS via pattern sensor. There's a similarities between these cameras.
But then, of course, they differ in many other aspects, like the maximum horizontal resolution. I wanted to make it shorter, so I just figured that, or gave you the figure for the horizontal resolution of these particular cameras. You can see, there's a huge difference between these models, or these cameras. And even there, the base ISO giving you the basic sensitivity of the camera, I see quite big differences. And then latitude, another aspect that you mentioned would be very important, shooting in the forest, having no real possibilities to light on a huge scale. So, okay, if I see that, then looks quite clear to me. I mean, there's the Red Epic Dragon, the new one, has definitely the biggest resolution, has the highest ISO, has huge amount of latitude, so of course that has to be your choice.
But hold on, these are only the manufacturer's specs, so we have to look deeper into it. Don't trust the websites of the manufacturer. Especially here I want to mention the Canon C500, for example. Of course it has a base sensitivity of 850 ISO, but out of these cameras, out of my experience, it is the best low light camera there on the list in terms of, you know, shooting at a little amount of light. Just an example out of experience. So it's always important to test and test yourself. So that's what we did, a lot of tests in the beginning. And it's all a bit boring in one way, because I did this 150 times and it's always the same thing. But it's always the same start, and you shouldn't, because things change within a year so quickly that since 15 years I haven't stopped doing these kind of tests. It's very important to keep this building into yourself as a routine, because you'll always find out interesting things while testing.
And today it is like cameras change their properties with firmware updates.
Yeah,
which is
great idea.
Quite a new thing. So
Yeah.
maybe you just explain a little bit.
Should we dim the light a little bit for that, maybe?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So you maybe explain a little bit the test setup, why you chose this frame.
Yeah, the idea was to have a bit of a forest there, and like have like different green tones and warm tones, and actually see like setting up some high contrast points. Unfortunately, I expected it to be sunny that day, because then I could have done the latitude test, the contrast range test of the camera in one shot. Because it was a little bit overcast, I didn't get there, but the important thing about this test setup is, which Dirk is very happy about.
Absolutely. See this here and that here, called a color checker and a gray card. And
how many tests have you seen where the DP just points the camera out of the window and just comes to the grading and...
Too many.
Too many?
Or,
it's a great camera, it looks great.
They think, well, I put a text chart in there, but it's a lot smaller than here, or it's cropped, and it's different from shot to shot maybe, and it's not properly just set up with the angle, so they don't really care that much about the setup with the light and where you put the chart, and it just helps you a lot, because what you're going to see now, this is the Epic Dragon, and we always alternate with the same exposure level to the Epic MX. You can see they were mounted side by side, so it was possible to shoot them at the same time. That's why you have the indications of the camera settings on one chart, because they were recording at the same time. I go just back. This is normal exposure of both cameras, going back and forth. Do you notice something? Noise? Sharper?
Color of the sweater changed a lot.
Yeah, that's something quite dramatic, I think. And it's, of course, not only the sweater. If you look in the trees in the background, you can see it there as well, but the sweater is really quite obvious.
And the skin as well.
And then, if you look at the skin, you notice, oh, okay, it actually also changes in skin tone.
And that's actually already after roughly grading it according to the test chart. So basically it is already tried to match those cameras a little bit. So,
and I notice it's maybe hard to read, but here it says ASA. ASA is basically the same as ISO. It's just ASA is the American Standardization Association. ISO is the international one.
what does it say there?
500, but didn't I read like with the Epic, with the Dragon 1600?
Well, I think that's where I started kind of researching before doing this test. The thing is, I don't trust any manufacturer's specs, and the first thing I tried to find out what actually is the base sensitivity of the camera. And Red had a bit of a mishap, where basically they released the camera with they claimed 1600 ASA, I think it is more about 1200. And then they found out after a few productions have been made on that camera that there's a big issue with flares, like direct light hitting the sensor and it kind of reflecting back through the OLPF filter, and that there were some problems. It's like a filter which is in front of every camera basically. So in the middle of the camera. So in the middle of kind of production, they exchanged those filters, which was a few weeks before I did this test. And that filter, changed the sensitivity of the camera from 1200 to maybe something like 500, more realistically. So this is why I don't trust any manuals and any technical specs. I build my own opinion and do that through testing. So that's already established. If I wouldn't have known that, you would have seen these tests being already completely different and non-comparable, because I would have rated the camera differently. So it's an important thing to kind of come up with starting up. So 500 is a bit conservative, but actually it's not that far away from where you can rate this camera 800 at points, but we ended up doing a lot at 640, but 500 is a good comparing point.
So if I skip through now, you don't see much, you have to read here, that is then in +1, meaning that is actually overexposed by one stop by opening the aperture of the lens.
Again, this idea is here to kind of, because I didn't have a high contrast scene, I had to kind of simulate that by doing a test with like overexposing it take by take, shot by shot. So I see what happens actually if we get it brighter and brighter, the image. Can I pull it back in the grading? So that's what is being already corrected. So naturally you would see it going brighter and brighter and brighter, but it's corrected in the grading. So basically it's like what happens if you overexpose and correct down.
This is 3 stops overexposed already, so normally the image would be already very bright, but everything is pulled down now to match it to the normal exposure. And you can start to see, like on the very bright parts of the car, the reflections in the sky, that things start to look a bit different. And if I go to the MX camera, you can clearly see that. That's also 3 stops over, that weird kind of color tint comes in. And if we go further, 4 stops over, looks still quite okay, but here it becomes kind of nasty already.
That's what I've known from the Red MX camera, that actually it has this problem, I would say, limitation of poor highlight, overexposure possibilities. It clips very badly, and if it looks like that, then it's definitely not usable anymore.
Yeah, and so that's the difference. 5 stops over with the old Epic MX and with a Dragon sensor, so that's quite...
But you'd have to be really blind and crippled in order not to see that in your viewfinder exposing it so far, because the picture is all white, you can't see that. So just to give you a feel, it's like you can still shoot a movie with the Epic MX camera. It's just kind of... The interesting thing is when you bring it to the limits, the camera. So then we do the same thing going down into underexposure, going darker, and correcting it again by pushing it in grading and bringing it back to the neutral image. So now what you'll see is, in overexposure, what you'll see is clipping of the whites and a change of colors at a point. In underexposure, you'll see that basically the blacks will clip eventually, so you look into the shadows, so the car already is completely clipped, as you can see. And the addition of noise, which comes up if you kind of bring up the picture again. And there I must say my findings were that actually the Red Epic MX was slightly better. I mean, not a big part, but I mean a hair better than what the Dragon was doing here actually, in terms of noise. You see it. We see it later in different comparison in the motion picture. The kind of grain parts there look already quite bad. But again, we are
minus
-5
5 stops. That's usually pretty dark.
That is already, yeah.
And that's of course you never try them, or you would never in grading then try to bring out 5 stops underexposed camera to a normal level. So that's quite extreme. Yeah, we have also prepared, because that was just to find out how the new Dragon sensor, because you haven't worked with that, how that behaves to the Epic, to then also do a comparison with the Alexa camera.
Could we dim the light completely for this, please? Thank you. I'll talk you through. So, same setup, similar situation, just in a nice split screen. You see the Alexa on the left and the red Dragon on the right. Don't bother about the different lenses. Again, I wanted to shoot in parallel, and that's why these were the lenses I had, basically. So this is purely about overexposure, latitude, and sensitivity. So again, +1. We go to the overexposure. We already know that the Alexa is very strong at preserving the highlights and high contrast scenes. I mean, that was it's the strongest take for this camera. I mean, that's why I like the camera a lot as well for certain applications. And the Dragon was claiming to be much better there than the Epic before, so it's an interesting test to see what it does. So you can especially focus on the sky and the skin tones, how they start to overexpose, and also on the gray on the color chart. You see the tones of gray between white and mid-gray. So you see at the point when they there's no differentiation anymore. That's the point where you kind of lose, where you get into the overexposure clipping. So that's +5 stops. I can see here that if you can hold for a second. So, custom laser pointer to finish?
Yeah. Me?
Okay. Sorry. Yeah, okay. So if you look at at this here at the gray scale, you already see that here there's very little differentiation. So already here the Dragon is kind of losing on the highlights a little bit. You also see the sky. This area is a bit bright. Whereas here there's still a hint of differentiation. I mean, I would say the difference in my experience is less than a stop. A little less, but around a stop. It's something one can work with. It's not a huge difference, but it is there. I mean, still the Alexa is a bit stronger on this side. And also you see the skin here on the highlight side is already starting to clip. Now that's 6 stops. Again, you would never shoot a scene like that. I mean, you would see a super bright shot and not being able to differentiate anything. But
otherwise, you also have the wrong job.
Yeah. Everybody can expose an Alexa, I think. As you see here already, the red camera is already struggling a bit to keep the highlights on the skin, whereas the Alexa is still doing it well. I don't mind it that much in terms of this is a challenge for me to keep the camera within exposure here. I don't have to have full safety on the highlights on the other camera. But very impressive what the Alexa can do here. So this is a kind of test I do before every film. I did it before 127 hours, before SLUMDOG. Every film, Antichrist, I did that basically all the time for every project, and it's important to do that. Again, we started neutral, now we go to underexposure. So now you have to look for noise and grain to come up, so that's -1 stop. And also for the loss of detail in the shadows here. So here you see, I mean, just for a little explanation, the red starts to get a little bit more noisy, a bit more grainy than the Alexa, but it has more details in the shadows still. Here it kind of starts to be a little bit more, like the blacks are a little bit, you see, especially on the grayscale here, it starts to crunch the image a little bit more on the shadow side here, if you go underexposed. But the noise seems to be a bit stronger on the red, actually. And then we see here -3 stops. That is already looking pretty nasty in terms of the grain, especially the color noise is a little bit irritating. But again, it's already very much underexposed. That's like rating the camera at 3,000, I say, 3,200. See the Alexa here? It looks more pleasing, the grain and everything. But again, you lose a lot of details on the shadow side. So I think
and it does look less in focus, basically, the red. You can see
sharpness,
a higher resolution to start off.
Now, not that I would ever expose a shot like that, but it's important to know if you start shooting the forest at dusk and you need to kind of capture the beginning of a daylight, and it's so over here. So very noisy. And if you look closely at the red camera, I mean, both are not usable for cinema anymore, but the red camera has this kind of vibrating, pulsing noise. You can see it here at -5 stops. Now that really caught my attention because it's not supposed to be there like that. I mean, it can be noisy, it can be grainy, you can stand still noise reduce in post-production, but this is not normal. So, and again here, the Alexa, less noisy, but losing a lot of details in the shadows. So that kind of caught my attention, thinking something is wrong here with red. It shouldn't look that bad. So after a bit of researching and looking again, I must admit, I got a bit lazy about doing black shading, black balancing, because even the Epic camera, which still requires doing that, is quite okay if you don't do it. I have just shot before that a big test, studio scene test inside, and I took the camera out and I didn't re-black shade the camera, which is obviously with the Alexa and other cameras you don't have to do it. With the Red Dragon, I was assuming you don't have to do it, and actually that was one of the points. So when we saw that test in projection, and I was unhappy, I tried to find out what is the reason for that. I took the cameras back into another test round, redid the black balancing, and we see here, it's still noisy, but actually, it was still noisy, but we lost this kind of vibrating, pulsing noise. So that actually was a problem of not black balancing the camera properly before.
Mm-hmm. So even, yeah.
So 2015, you still have to do a few things to keep your camera assistant busy sometimes. There was another little issue that the red camera we received from testing actually had this filter we spoke about, the OLPF filter, reverse mounted. So actually there was another thing adding to that. But since I figured all of these out through extensive tests, I was able to tackle all these issues.
So you had these tests. You were thinking about Sony and Canon as well, but mainly for other applications, not for main photography.
Yeah, I kind of knew that the camera I'm going to choose for the main part of the shooting will have to have certain strengths and certain abilities, and I was actually thinking about. We were actually thinking about that for the low light moments at dusk and dawn, to use a different camera, have a second camera with us, which is able to capture very, very nicely these forest scenes at a high sensitivity. So I was thinking to combine cameras actually with the main camera setup.
But from your experience, you could, because you tested them before and know the specs, you could kind of rule out because of aspects like storage, recording or whatever, you could rule them already out, right?
Yeah, I didn't want to, I mean, because already I didn't want to work in uncompressed raw material in 4K, and I didn't want to compromise on going 2K, which would have been data-wise maybe easier to handle, but since I spoke about the texture of the forest I wanted to capture, so that was not an option. It was clear it would have to be a camera in an area of at least 4K, and I'd want to be compressed on the recording side, so the amount of data wasn't so difficult. So now this was...
So this is basically what you then kind of summed up for the producers, mainly,
yeah.
I think, your findings in comparing these cameras, and you made up, because that was a quite, there was still the wish maybe to shoot with the Alexa, because they were more experienced with that and have used it before, so you made up this basic numbers, also thinking not about only what is how it works on set, but also how to record and how to manage all the data. And that's an interesting aspect when you want to go with this high resolution, and then for a camera like the Alexa, you might want to shoot anamorphic. It comes with all these other dependencies. Okay, you need anamorphic lenses, you have this and that and so on, which might where you then have to compromise in availability of focal length and so on. But it also just ends up shooting with raw images and creating much more data, even though the resolution of the Alexa camera is still a lot smaller than the red one. The red one, the Epic, and the Dragon, of course.
Yeah, and as you can see, obviously there were concerns from production side. Our producer has also been working as a post-production supervisor for some time, and he knew from past that working with red cameras can be a hassle in post-production, can be. if it's not well prepared, and that actually obviously the amount of data is going to be bigger than shooting Alexa ProRes. But since that wasn't really an option, I mean the option would have been possibly to go Alexa RAW and with shooting anamorphic lenses. There actually the interesting thing is even though you have a resolution of 2.8K, that it uses actually 50% more data than a red camera shooting at 6K in a compression of 6:1. Now, that is an interesting finding that for less resolution, you require more data.
Mhm.
And now knowing the shooting ratio of our film, after we ended up everything, how many terabyte was it? Do you remember, Philip?
30.
40?
Yeah, we had 2 rates
Yeah.
and we had I think on the one rate it was
Yeah.
full,
Yeah.
something like 25.
I think
and
it's
the other
on
rate
Valentine. I think
Okay.
I think I have the numbers later in one
Okay.
of Valentine's.
But I mean, just to give you a feeling, like 40 terabyte, which was already like more than I expected, but it came because we shot 2 cameras. This would have been 60 or 60 terabyte on the Alexa in RAW and 80 terabyte shooting in 4K on an uncompressed RAW camera. So this would have been a significant cost factor.
So I think I have an idea what camera you use to shoot the film. You probably as well. So it turned out to be a red Epic with a Dragon sensor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it turned out to be this camera. Another aspect why I felt the tendency to use this camera was size and ergonomics in terms of weight. I knew we were going to carry all this gear into the forest every single day. Now, the Alexa at that point would have been bigger, heavier, more things to carry in a sense. So I was thinking ergonomics at the same time as well. So maybe talk through a little bit through specifications of the camera and what we've used. So we shot full frame in the full resolution the camera possibly can do in 6K, which has an aspect ratio of 1 to 1.9. It's not quite a standard thing, but that's what the camera does. And then we came up with the idea. I had the idea after reading an article about David Fincher's Gone Girl, where they've used the camera, the Dragon, that was the first film to be shot on Dragon. They were shooting 6K, framing for 5K, because David Fincher is like, he really wants to be having all possibilities later in post-production to stabilize, reframe, not only zooming in, but also zooming out. And I found that concept quite appealing and interesting. So, but I found sacrificing like 5K, like this much of resolution to go 5K was a bit much. So we decided to frame for 5.5K. So you have the whole image, you record it, and you have a frame leader which shows you the 5.5K image. Now, for this, we can actually now move into every direction in post-production, which was also helpful like for some of the Steadicam work we did in the forest, where you have one take and you want to be able to reframe a little bit. But also having, for distribution later, the possible 16:9 version in mind, which we hope we don't have to do. But if we have to do it now, because of the resolution overhead, we don't have to do like a pan scan zooming into an anamorphic picture and then kind of getting your 16:9 out of that, which would have been the case shooting anamorphic on Alexa, for example. But actually, you have on all sides quite a bit more room, so you can open the picture up, and actually, like, I think you only have to crop it by 10% to then get a 16:9 master later on. So that in mind, it's this minor thing, but it really kind of.
From my experience, if you don't know if you have to deliver a 16:9 master of your film, then you have to. It's like it just always happened. Even on bigger productions, maybe DOP and even director don't care anymore, but because of the contracts with distribution and so on, you have to deliver even an open gate 16:9 without letterbox things and so on.
That's the thing people will see in airplanes later, for example. So moving on, so the resolution, that's it. I mean, we rated the camera most of the time between 400 and 640. Obviously, sometimes if you don't have more light, like in a dusk scene, we also went brave and rated it sometimes for 1200 or 1600 ASA. But this was a main shooting sensitivity rated the camera for. The latitude, remember the specs, it says 16.5 stops. Mm-hmm. Well, that's again manufacturer specifications. The camera can do that if you shoot HDR actually, so you can actually shoot an HDR image, but the problem of that is that then the camera shoots 2 streams of video, which means much more data, and it's difficult to bring it together. It works on a nice static white shot, but where you can kind of mix those images and get latitude to the shot. But most of the time when the camera moves or you have actors moving, it actually doesn't work that nicely anymore. So basically, forget about HDR, it's for certain specifications. The real latitude I found usable is around 13 stops.
For lenses,
The
why
len- yeah.
did you? I just know from other tests and so on, they have very beautiful lenses, but usually they're quite expensive, relatively new. Why did you choose
We
them?
use the Leica Summilux lenses for different reasons. This is one of the few sets of lenses which is actually built and calculated for digital sensors, and it actually, they actually work wide open. They have a wide open stop of 1.4, and even up to wide open, they're still very sharp, high resolution, and usable at that spot. So because now you see, I had to sacrifice with this camera compared to other cameras on the sensitivity. I tried to compensate that using faster lenses at a point. The second point why we used those lenses was because the Dragon has a bigger sensor than most other cameras. It's actually 20% bigger than that of the Alexa. It actually moves out of the PL mount, not a PL mount specification, which means that 70% of lenses which are out on the market don't work with the Dragon. You'll have vignetting or soft corners, so you can't use the camera at full resolution.
This is basically how it would look with a lens that is just able to project an image on the Super 35 sensor, and if you then put a bigger sensor in the same spot, you will get vignetting and softening and so on the edges. So basically you have to find a lens that is big enough to also cover the full size of this sensor. How much percentage is it? Like
14% over Super 35 versus, for example, 94-95% of the Alexa, which is a thing also. It's difficult with the lenses, but it's also a thing I like because you can use, you basically, for every shot for the same kind of frame, you use a longer lens, which gives you a bit more of a 70mm depth of field feeling on this camera. That's what I kind of like, and especially if you use a zoom lens, which we sometimes did for the film. Now the zoom lens has a usable wide open stop of 2.8. Now, because the depth of field changes as well, because you use a longer lens, you are able to create a similar depth of field on a 2.8 lens as you have on a prime lens at stop 2. That's very technical now, but for the people of you who know a bit about it, I just try to explain. And another reason why we liked the Leica lenses were because they were quite lightweight, and a lot of stuff was done with Steadicam, so they were kind of pretty compact and really, really sharp. And they actually had a nice look to them. That's also important, I think, that they were sharp and crisp, but without being too uncosmetic in terms of a look. And the filters, should I do it now, or do you want to talk about this?
The filters, briefly?
Briefly, very briefly. I never shoot digital without diffusion filters. It's just a rule of mine to kind of break the image down a bit. So because the camera has such a high resolution, and because the Leica lenses are so crisp, we did lots of tests. Again, that you can only do by test and find your own taste. We tested filters and we chose Tiffen SoftFX filters, which I've used for a long, long, long time on many films, just to break that image down. Otherwise, if you shoot a close-up of an actress, your makeup department will go mad. Okay. We also did lots of makeup tests, very important as well, shooting with a new camera. Spend a day shooting your actors with actual makeup. Actually, we changed of one of our actresses the makeup actually twice after these tests to find a makeup that doesn't look too artificial and at the same time helps for pleasing skin.
A huge other topic that I'm very aware of, because that's then always in the grading suite when you find out that, oh, that looks somehow made up. I can really see kind of the material and so on. Can we fix that? Well, I'm pushing a little bit because we also still want to talk about all the steps after camera choice and lens choice, and because then it goes on. You have to think about what happens in post-production and how you get there and how do you manage all the material. You might lose certain aspects of our decision matrix for the camera because they don't really affect what is happening with everything after it has been recorded in the camera. But of course you gain other things, like suddenly you talk about transfer times because someone has to sit there and copy your material from one compact flash card or other medium from the camera to another device. And also in post-production, you need to talk about storage again, about the data rate that you can process things, and things like the ease of editing. A certain material is maybe not very well suited for being live edited. If you ever tried to edit like DSLR footage that's in this H.264 codec, computers are striving a lot to actually cope with this very highly compressed material. And you mentioned that because of the setup that the editor was using, he was reluctant to go to a higher bitrate quality codec for the editing. So suddenly you have to think about these aspects as well. What kind of file format are you rendering to, and so on. So let's talk a little bit about the data management and the dailies workflow, because I found that interesting as well, and it's always a big discussion, at least when it comes to how does the material look once it gets into grading. That's why I rush through a little bit of what usually should happen from set into post-production, meaning basically first step editing. On the way there, you will probably not take your original camera media and just bring it over to the editor and have him work. You will want to make ideally multiple copies of the material somewhere in between. So these copies should be verified. They should not just be copied by a finder or something like that. There are means to make sure that a copy of your original file is really identical to the previous one. And believe me, from own experience again, it just happens a lot. You think you are in the digital world, and if you copy something, it's always just identical. No, it's not. There are still like physical parts in the computer, in connection cables and so on involved that can actually alter some bits, sometimes a few more bits, and you end up with a corrupt image. Maybe it's just dropouts in the image, maybe it's a complete corrupt frame. So please use these verification tools. And then there's still the idea that maybe someone should have a look at the images. Something that always happened in film production as well. It was transferred and there was a dailies colorist sitting and checking your material, giving you a call to inform you about the density of the neck or how well it was exposed in these days. So other things like sharpness, even a copy verification tool will not tell you whether everything was in focus or not. And if you have very limited small monitors on set, maybe you missed that. You have an issue with some of the lens or something like that. That's called the quality control or quality check, QC, which is, I find, neglected a lot of times because people are not aware of that. Then you might think, and that's a little bit of our discussion coming up, you want to change how the material was recorded in camera, look-wise, into something else before it's edited. And before it can be edited, of course, you need to sync sound and you need to render files usually in a different file format to get it into the editing system. So how did that actually work on your production? How was it done?
Well, the original idea was...
Or how was it planned originally?
Originally was planned. Again, it's cost involved, and it's nothing new to me not to be involved in these decisions, but actually I fight my way through it, especially because of my past, having worked at these steps quite extensively before. Was planned to have a data wrangler on set who just does the copying of the media, and then to put all the other aspects of it, meaning quality control, creating of rushes, rendering rushes, and the editorial for the editorial, the Avid compressed media. All of it was planned to be in the post-production facility in Luxembourg. Now, I and Felix as well, we both had a very strong idea about doing this on set because we know what it means to be that having the person doing that close to us, yeah, and actually being able to get a faster feedback if something is wrong. Now again, this camera we've been using was quite new, so I still had my doubts in terms of, I just wanted to make sure that if something goes wrong, we won't find out 2 days later, but we have immediate feedback on set. So my personal take was not having the setup of the production, but having the setup of having a DIT on set, a very capable person of doing all of it. And the second thought, obviously, of mine was as well explaining it, that you can actually save cost, because the process has to be done anyway. So if you do it on set or on post-production, if you grade rushes, it has to be done somewhere. And usually, in my experience, and that it's been on a few projects, that people look for the cost on set, and there's a certain number, and they have a post-production budget. But now you can actually take out that amount of the post-production budget, and you might only spend a fraction of that amount that the service will cost you in post-production on a higher salary of a good DIT who might do all of these things for you. And then it's a win-win situation, both for producers and for us cinematographers.
Not for the post house, though. It's a win-win-lose, maybe.
Yeah, win-win-lose. Okay. Yeah.
But also the post house. I mean, some of them have to calculate or have to give a number for the whole thing, and then it's of course difficult budgeting this. They don't really gain that much, but thinking about what is best for the project. You have to consider when it's happening so far away, and the kind of turnover times to get feedback from a person that you probably don't know, because maybe it's exchanging crew or staff from the post house, is not as ideal as you want. And it's mainly not true for all the productions, but you should consider what is best for this purpose.
And then 127 hours, that was one of the things which went madly wrong, why they only found out 2 days after that there was footage missing from set. So just to give you a big budget example of how things can go wrong.
Yeah, and you didn't find out how they actually do the quality control unless you went there and inspected the post house. Yeah. So we don't have the time anymore to I wanted to ask people what they think is a DIT. Are there DITs in the audience? That's despite the very strange description in the program. But so all the others, are there producers? So what is a DIT? I would like to know from the producers. Do you know? You heard the term? Okay. Do you know what it stands for?
Yeah, I think in commercial production,
Mm-hmm.
where the DIT is like the person in charge that the material is safe. And
There's a microphone.
that
Okay.
everything is. Sorry, again.
So in commercial production, you say?
Yeah, I've been in commercial productions where the DIT is the person in charge that the material
Mm-hmm.
it's safe and it's in multiple discs.
Yeah,
And,
multiple copies.
Yeah, and that everything is going good in the production. So if we need retakes or something,
Mm-hmm.
he will be like in charge of telling everybody.
Okay. So then what is a data wrangler, or sometimes more officially called a data assistant or data manager?
I don't know that.
Because that fits exactly the description for a data wrangler. That's not saying that it's wrong that the DIT would do this. But maybe there is a difference between. So I think it's very difficult to nail it, because it's a very changing job description. It has taken a long time to come up with this term, digital imaging technician. That's the abbreviation, DIT. And since then, it has been in fluctuation all the time. Originally, once you were a DIT, what did you do, like in the early HD times?
Well, I was mostly kind of handling the camera from a technical side. There were very complicated menu structures in those cameras, so I actually very often created like a camera setup, which was close to something like a pre-grading in the camera, because we didn't have raw recording in the beginning. So my work was actually very close to the cinematographer, understanding his vision and the idea how the film should look like, and then following this process and being very intensely involved in actually changing camera parameters and also the camera setup to achieve that vision.
And as you said, this doesn't happen that much anymore, but still there might be the idea of someone who's not only in charge of making those copies, but someone that becomes a link to post-production that actually does talk about the camera setup, the viewing setup, what kind of monitors you use, and so on. So there are a couple of aspects in digital production on set that maybe someone professional should care about. And I find, especially from the production side, that there's usually like a misconception or not really an awareness of these things, that they should be done by a professional and not just by an assistant that is able to manage this software that does the hopefully properly verified clones of the original material. So we strived to give you an idea, just to give you a list of things that a DIT should definitely be able to do, and if he or she is claiming can do but is not able to fulfill that, then maybe it's rather a data wrangler. But of course there are especially young people coming up from this data managing aspect that are so keen on doing more and learning fast that they understand all the concepts that are necessary to do this link into post-production that actually can work with grading software and even do your brushless grading on set. So it is like a field where with lots of transition between back and forth. But our main idea here is that you should be aware that it's more than just copying the data that should be taken care of on set. So I know that you were very lucky to have a very good DIT on set, because ideally these DITs, or sometimes these things are also done by post supervisors or post-production. Some of these I did as a kind of consultant to productions to come up with specifications for your shooting workflow, going even into post-production, sometimes into finishing. And they have, for instance, maybe also to be communicated with bonding companies, because they want a certain security aspects be fulfilled, like how many copies are there all the time, at what stage, and what is your long-term archiving format, and so on. So it can be quite colorful or more just content-wise, and there should be, yeah, well, it was actually 30 terabyte. That's from Dark Side of the Moon. In German, the description from the DIT of the actual workflow, some kind of even file naming convention, folder convention. That's brilliant. Your post house will love it. Up until how reels were named, how time code should be handled on set, so that there is not, just because you're shooting over midnight, a time code break in it. And since he couldn't prevent it on some, I don't know, pre-shooting day or whatever, he was the one to making aware of that. So in the end of the production, he made a final version of this report, so that everyone involved later in post-production has information about the production process. And here you can see also the description of the framing. So the gray one is actually what was recorded in camera, the 6K of the epic, and the light gray one is the frame leader, basically, that you had. This is how it was framed, and the outer part is what is still there to stabilize in post-production or to actually zoom out and so on. Very helpful, good information. And a lot of times I experienced this is just in the head of some people, but it's not properly communicated. And I experienced a second unit shooting that was in another country where they decided to shoot 25 frames per second. Well, all main photography was 24 frames per second. Because no one just knew, no one really communicated that, and it just happened, because it's done in that country always like that. Another thing that he did on a daily basis, basically, creating footage reports. Since they are one of the really good ones, I was copying them in here, where you actually get thumbnails of the graded material, with information about the clip name, the reel, and further information whether it's a copy or non-copy, and so on. And this went out to producers so that they knew that was shot, the amount of storage for every shooting day, and so on. That is how it can be done. And he also took care about the grading. So you had the possibility on set to actually talk about how things should look like in the editing. And I don't know, what is your experiences with this? Should it be graded or should it not be graded?
Well, since many films, which I also worked on as a colorist, I always see this hesitation of a director to move on from what he's seen several years sometimes in the editing system. And especially on films where rushes were not graded. And sometimes even in the worst case, seeing some strangely converted log material, which is very soft. All of a sudden the director sits in the grading and sees a technical not correct image and says, oh, I like that look. And he can't explain to you because he felt so much. It's a psychological thing. You get used to something, this is your film, this is your shaping process, and all of a sudden you're stuck with something which objectively, for me as a colorist, looks terrible, but he thinks he's made an artistic choice. And I had this happening with like very, very experienced directors. I've been personally, because every project I take on, I take very personal and I try to take the best out of it, also artistically. I myself take up many fights trying to convince him why it is better to rethink the process, and still it doesn't work. So from that experience I can only say graded rushes are very good.
I mean, there are many ways of doing graded rushes on different levels, and this is actually taken basically from the camera output, more or less, because this is how it looked when you were recording. Could you dim the light?
Dim the lights, yeah, thanks. This is how we saw the material on set, basically. We had a very good monitor on set, and that's how we actually saw it. That's how we kind of were working on set. Exposing, judging the scene.
Looks already quite nice, I would say.
Not bad.
This is then what you did in rushes grading to further enhance it, and it does make a difference, I think. You might say, okay, maybe, yeah, that's an artistic thing, but it would not have been a big problem to just edit with this material. It wouldn't really have influenced the editing process, I think.
No, but again, the director would have gotten used to the warm skin tone, the softness of it, and then all of a sudden, later in the grading process, there would be discussions whether it can be colder or not. So
that's where you brought some other examples to maybe explain it a bit more.
So we now see a few scenes which we first of all see how they would look like if you would not apply any grading and just export the footage as it is from the red raw material with a standard preset. So you see it is already looking alright, it's kind of okay, and for rushes maybe the thing, but I just felt it lacks the feeling of the genre movie, the look we talked about. It's all a bit.
That was quite a harsh cut now. I mean, it was really very dark, and maybe so dark that some people might say, oh.
Didn't match quite the reverse shot. So now we here see our rushes grading. So we really try to work on separating the colors, bringing some contrast, and especially color contrast was an important aspect for it. And obviously adjusting for the mood of the scene. So you can really see how the blue tones and the warmth, especially there on her skirt and the blanket, are kind of nicely coming up. You see this shot was lifted up in the grading, so it matches the close-up, the reverse shot a bit more.
It feels much better also when you would do a review with your producers or other people of the film. But that looks...
Now we see some split screen comparison, so you see what happens.
If I look at what you did, that's more than just a simple like overall contrast enhancement, I would say.
Don't you think you can achieve that in the grading with the primaries?
I'm not quite sure, because certain colors are a bit stronger pushed than others, and in primary grading what you can do is like you just you create the contrast, you can maybe make the shadows a bit more bluish and the highlights a little warmer. But if you want to pick certain colors, then that's more work, and it's something that I would normally not do in rushes grading because it takes more time, but this looks more sophisticated, I would say.
Yeah, I think you spotted it exactly. I mean, the idea was that we did a so-called LUT grading, which was a thing maybe Dirk can explain. What is a LUT? It's a film emulation lookup table.
Basically, it's a filter that emulates a certain kind of color correction. Can be a very complex one. And the film lookup table would emulate how something looks when you would print it back to film. Originally, a very technical kind of meaning of changing colors. It can also be used very creatively, and you used it very creatively, I think, in pushing certain colors, like pushing this blue cyan in the shadows, for instance, and pushing the skin tones a bit warmer.
So this is one example for like the available light we sometimes had to struggle with in contrast terms. And you lose the contact to the actor. That was just morning hour. We didn't have more light. So as you've seen it on the first rushes grading, there was no mood. You could hardly see the actor. And it was very important to kind of bring that up. Here he was nearly invisible in the backlight. So to have that will also affect the editor and the director. He might just say, it's too dark, I can't see the actor. Let's cut to the close-up immediately. Let's not use that shot. So, Well, this, for example, we were in a big rush, greenish and dark. We were in a big rush shooting that scene. We only had the afternoon for a whole scene as the end of a scene, so we weren't able actually in the time to kind of refine our lighting the way we wanted to. Had to work pretty quickly. So you see, it's a bit on the dark side here, but as you'll see soon with the rushes grading, we're able to bring up the faces and kind of, depict the mood of a scene for the genre. It helps you a lot to kind of have a more consistent result, and especially these days where you do feature films sometimes in 24, 22 days of shooting, where you just have to run around and improvise. That's where, a rushes grading will really give you a more consistent look. This is a scene where it actually is more, the parts before are a bit cosmetic in terms of grading. This was a complete essential thing, because this scene, even though it doesn't look like it, is supposed to be a night scene.
Again, this is how it would have looked on the monitor. This was the kind of live output from the camera that we just recreated by using the metadata in the original camera files and rendered it. So that was like...
And I've seen a lot of things. We planned this to be day for night, and I've seen it very often to happen in the editing, that the editor would just put up a filter, color filter, make it kind of blue and dark, and make it look terrible because it's not his job description. But then the scene is like this for forever in the film up until we go into the grading phase. So here now we see how the rushes grading of that scene looked like, and that's not using like too many elaborate tools. So in the final grading, you'll still be able to pick up the sky, get it darker, but already it kind of has the mood for the scene, and you know what kind of world you're within.
It's definitely late evening or something, and it does make
dusk
a whole lot of a difference to the whole mood of it.
Yeah, and again, if the editor would have seen the other scene, emotionally the director would have been lost in terms of the mood of the scene, not being able really to judge if this moment really works or not. And again, we'll see a few split screen comparisons here. So a question you could ask is, why didn't we shoot it like in old days when we did day for night?
That's what I wonder. Can't you do that in camera?
Of course you can. You can just put in a blue filter and make it nice and dark. But the thing is, and you're going to feel it in the final product in the end after the grading, is the fact that you lose if you do that. I always, whatever I do shooting wise, I always want to have as much information as possible in the footage. So I wouldn't, unless something is clipping in the highlights, I wouldn't underexpose a day for night shot. But keep it like that, and the result in the end is going to be that you have much more shades of gray and much more differentiation, in the picture. And if you see like underexposed day for night stuff in the camera, usually you only have like 3-4 grayscales, and it's all very crunchy and dark. And this way you can have a buttercream soft night look later.
So, oops. It did so far, I hope, already help, because you're still editing, or the editing is still in progress, the film. But
a big advantage, sorry to interrupt, obviously is as well, you do a screening, you do a trailer, as we did
exactly
today.
what I wanted to say. The trailer that you have seen was just taken from these graded brushes. There was no additional grading involved in that. It was really just, and of course, when you grade brushes, the only reference that you have is like going through the other shots that fit to the scene and try to match it there, but you have no idea how it's eventually cut together. So that's a real difficult task in grading dailies, and I don't do it anymore and don't really like doing it. It's really very difficult. And if you think about the trailer again, I think it looked very nice, and nobody would have questioned that it was like a properly finished and graded trailer.
Also for screenings later, because films tend to have like test screenings in the process. You want to sit with the director in a projection to see how the editing comes together. It makes such a huge difference to see it in that quality in the cinema. You get a total different feel for the mood of a film, as opposed to watching just some fluffy, grey, low contrast, offline material.
Since we only have like 8 minutes left, 7. And so that we didn't bring this little thing here that you probably wonder already what's it about. We should, I guess, open up for questions. We're basically through with our presentation. We run a little bit longer than expected. But are there any questions about this film, about workflows, about camera choice, or whatever? Then feel free. And meanwhile, I'm going to prepare our to shoot up. There's also another.
Thank you. When do you make your lookup table, the lot? It's, of course, you have that blue thing,
Yeah.
and you have the forest, and you have the look for
Yeah.
the city.
Yeah.
Do you make like a, 5 different look, and you carry with them, in the set, or you do it like day by day?
There's 2 different questions within it. One is the LUT, the lookup table, which is kind of, you could say a filter through which you grade, which gives you a general look. You still have to grade the material. That Felix and I have been doing in tests before in advance. When we did some look tests for the film, Felix had a suggestion of which lookup tables to use. He's used it on a film before. So that kind of gives you a general adjustment of the color. I would say the choice of a film stock does to you, right, in old days. That's a kind of general feel how it looks. Then you still have to grade it. And that's a communication process between us and the dailies colorist to then say this is a day for night scene and have some, it's important to spend the first 2-3 days with the colorist and give him a feel for where the film should go. So he starts grading the stuff. In the beginning, the forest scenes turned out too warm, so we told him, okay, do it a bit colder, it's not so warm, it's supposed to be here. So that we did with the actual footage.
Was it during the shooting?
That was during the shooting.
Thank you.
Which was only possible because you had the grading on set, so you could further develop it. And
Yeah.
just to mention, a lookup table is not the savior of your film or of the look. It is one, and sometimes a very small part in it. Sometimes can be very essential. Sometimes it's just for technical adjustments because you want to bring certain different cameras more closer together. Lookup tables can do a great deal in that when they're professionally, technically done to match color spaces of different cameras and so on. It's not like, because there are some advertisements on the internet where you can buy lookup tables, it's not like, well, you just buy it, you put it on your film, and that's it. There's actually more work involved in it when you have these kind of complex lookup tables to grade with them than it is just without them.
Yeah.
You said you were working with the Tiffany the
soft
filters.
Yeah.
Did you have them all on all the time?
Yeah, in different variations. We knew before because we had those Leica primes, so we did test before knowing from which lens on the diffusion will get too strong, because the diffusion filters vary, the effect of it varies with the focal length. So we used the stronger ones on the wide lenses and the weaker ones on the long lenses. And we used one zoom lens, which was a bit softer, so there we used a weaker diffusion filter. But that's also part of extensive testing and seeing it.
What was your experience in diffusing?
Can you hold them?
What was your experience in diffusing in post-production? I mean, do you can you adjust for not having a diffusion filter on, or?
Yeah. Now every visual effects person will tell you now I can match any diffusion filter, no problem at all. I doubt that. I mean, it is possible to match it, but it has always a different feel. Like the filter, like if you saw in the trailer those backlit scenes in the forest, the filter will catch the light and it will kind of bloom it out differently depending on shot by shot basis, depending on light situation. If you want to embrace some flares, it will work differently. So to simulate all these things as a look for the film, you spend a hell amount of money in post-production. And I can most of the time tell you in cinema when a film was done with digital diffusion as opposed to optical diffusion. I see the difference. Just my personal opinion. I had many fights about it, but that's just me.
I would agree, and I would add, it's not so difficult to match maybe a single shot within a sequence where you have not had the filter at all, or where it was just too soft, and to then enhance it a bit more so that it matches in continuity again. But doing like a complete digital filter on top of it, I also tend to feel that it's digital and not real. More questions? Up there? And there?
Hello, thank you. I have one question. Why to go? When and why you are going for day for night? I mean, it's budget-wise or time-wise, or just to have all the information there and then do whatever you want later?
The first two, budget and time. This day we were shooting was a fully packed day, and we originally, I mean, that's like the vision. Originally you think we're going to shoot it at night, we're going to have all the lighting setups, we're going to have a rain machine there. That was a dream, to have rain and everything. And then we kind of came to reality of the budget and the time we have on that day, and the reality was different. Now, we still didn't, one option would have been to just say, let's make it a day scene, but that would have killed the mood of it all. And I think if you look at the complexity of a scene like that, to make that look nice and good at night, where you see the forest in behind and everything, we're talking about a Hollywood lighting setup, which is unaffordable over here. So in that sense, to see the water, to see the landscape and the street and everything, and not make it look like an American night from the 80s, which it would probably look like if we lit it, in that time, it just was the perfect scenario for it, I think.
Das zweite Mikrofon.
Good afternoon. I want to ask this, because where I come from, 75% of the filmmakers over there adopt guerrilla style of filmmaking. Okay, most of them are self-taught. You understand? So one of the problems we deal with is noise.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes when you shoot, we don't use big monitors when we shoot. So most of the time we depend on the little LCD monitors on the DSLR cameras, and you know, sometimes after you shoot, when you get back to the computer, it's what that you have noise on the frame. So I don't know, how do you deal with noise? You know, professionally. I don't know. Does it depend on the camera or the lenses you use? So how do you deal with noise? Maybe when you don't use the monitor or something.
It's a complex question because it's related to many, many aspects. First of all, obviously the camera. There are some cameras, if you talk about noise or low light scenes at night, there are some cameras which just have like a bad light sensitivity, and there you have no option basically. If you have no light, you shoot available light, you have a camera which has a bad low light performance, it will become noisy. Now you can help it with lenses, obviously. The faster the stop on the lens, the more actually you'll be able to capture. So sometimes it's helpful. Like for us, we knew if we would have shot the dusk scenes in the forest with a zoom lens, which is a 2.8, it would have been the end of it. It would have not worked. We would have not been able to make any single day. So that's why we chose very fast lenses. But then again, this is an expensive solution on a big set. If you work with DSLRs, the great thing is actually a prime lens is not expensive in the terms of to get. And if you take a 50mm with a 1.8 or 1.4, you already have a very fast lens. And then if you choose a camera, like for example, we mentioned Canon C500 is a great low light camera. So there you can fix quite a few things already in camera and get exposure there. So I think actually the cameras you are using are actually less noise prone than actually the big film cameras, digital film cameras we are using. They are way ahead of that in that aspect. So I need much more light than you do with a DSLR camera. That's an interesting development of technology. That's sometimes why I also use a DSLR camera on set to kind of capture scenes, because the expensive camera I have on set can't cope with those levels. So and you can fix some of it in post-production.
It's bad that the last sentence should be, you can fix it in post-production. So I'm tempted to give another question, but we have to leave, we have to clear the room. And I at least wanted to tell you why we brought this here. Could we dim the light, especially on the stage, maybe a little bit for the audience? Keep a little bit for the audience. So we have like 5 different screens now. Which picture would you pick? Which one do you like most? No, I'm not asking for a vote right now. What I want to show you is, you will probably see from every angle, this is a consumer television, and it looks quite significantly different to all the others. The other 3s and even the projection here are kind of okay. This is the preset just as we got it and we flipped it on. And that's not how you should watch films, and it is basically to give you, again, or make you aware that you as filmmakers, I guess all of you are involved in films, otherwise you wouldn't be here, spend a little bit of time looking at the devices, how they actually show the images. And even there are some meanings in the menu that you can tweak to make it a better experience. This was actually the monitor they had on set. I would definitely take this one. But even the laptop is not as bad. I have to admit, especially this brand does a good job in bringing out quite good screens. This is another on-set kind of broadcast style monitor. They have different technologies. You can see this here has like perfect black on the letterbox bars. This not really, and this also not, but it also depends a lot on the angle. And while you now unfortunately have to leave the room, you're welcome to just step by and have a closer look if you want. Thank you very much.